The developer's usually involved right at the beginning, maybe helping out to estimate, and then right through to delivery oftentimes. Depending on the size of the company, a lot of these things are variable depending on the agency and things. And because of that, I believe that we have a greater influence in those project life cycles than we might ordinarily think. The little disclaimer on the bottom there, this is my opinions and my experiences from working. So I work for a company called Method 4 in Cardiff. We're an Umbraco Gold Partner and Microsoft Gold Partner. We deliver Umbraco websites, web applications, SharePoint, bespoke stuff. So this is sort of from my experience. It's not necessarily presented as fact. It is designed to be a conversation starter. So if you think about who we think our audiences are, or our audience is, ordinarily for a website, of course, that's going to be the visitors that the website interacts with, and that's who we're ultimately building and designing for. But if we think of the project lifecycle itself, then the first one that would come to mind is the client, ultimately, because they're the one who have asked for the project, they're the one who are probably paying for the project. But client's quite a varied term, and it includes a lot of different people in that. So we've broken it down, and today I've broken it down into 5 different audiences, some on the agency side, some on the client side, some maybe external to those. So if we go through each of those 5 then, so we think we have editors, a pretty key audience, in my opinion, for an ECMS-based website. We have the developers, we have ourselves, we have our teams, we have maybe external support contractors, things like that. Designers, every website's going to have some element of design, regardless of who ends up doing it. Testers, quality assurance, user acceptance testing, things like that. And then the project managers, or potentially product owners in an agile environment, but the sort of decision makers of the project. So the point first to make off really is that there's potentially a wider audience than you might realize, and we all know that these people are involved in the project, but we might not see them necessarily as an audience of developers and development. Because I believe there are things that we can do with each of these that we can improve those relationships and potentially influence and guide their output to try and make sort of the best possible outcome that we can achieve. And coming back to the question of why for developers and what this has to do with developers, I'm pretty confident that's not strictly a Venn diagram, because there's something about a Venn diagram that makes it not quite accurate. But the point kind of still stands of the graphic of development is kind of sitting in the middle of quite a lot of things. It touches different areas. We're going to develop the editing environment. We're going to be testing the development. The design is going to be built on top of. All little things like this that mean development is sort of, in many ways, uniquely placed as a sort of role that we can play in here. And the developers can sort of really help those different audiences to bring it all together. So if we go on to now and have a look into each of those 5 different audiences and see what it is about them and see how we can potentially influence them and work better with them over the time. So if we make a start now with editors. So for me, the editors really are the primary audience. We're using Umbraco, so we're using a content management system. This is the point really, so that we can allow people to manage their content. And in many ways, the editors are relying on the Umbraco interface, the website itself, to do their job. So if we don't deliver a good product, or it's a poor product, or it's not tailored towards their needs, then we're going to be slowing them down, we're going to be getting in their way, we're going to be sort of affecting their workflow. Ultimately, we want to try and make Umbraco as invisible as possible. We don't want editors logging into a content management system to edit nodes. We want them logging into their website to edit their content. I think I'll just get that in. Is that okay? Still around? Audio? In and out a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
I'll try and stay near the middle as well, so we can switch that. Yeah, we want to make Umbraco as invisible as possible. So we want them interacting with their content in the way that they typically do. We don't want to try and change their workflows. We don't want to try and force them to work in a way that Umbraco works. And for us, we're very fortunate in being Umbraco developers, is that we can tailor Umbraco to our needs. We can customize it. We can change it around. It's very customizable. It's very extensible. So there's a lot of things that we can do to sort of help them there. And the first one for me, really the best way of doing this is to get the editors in front of Umbraco as soon as possible. even before we deliver the project, before the project is completed, we want to sort of get people using Umbraco as soon as we possibly can. So even if we are still developing on a project and we're not quite finished with it, the sooner we can get, let's just plug that in. There we go, that should be hopefully better. The sooner we can get it in front of them, the better. Because then we can start to understand how they use it, what features are they using, what features are they missing, and then from there we can start to influence and shape it. If we get it in front of them before we sort of finish development and then go into a testing phase and give it to the end client to start playing with, it's almost too late to make those changes. We have a case at the moment where we're switching the site away from what was originally SharePoint for many reasons, now moving into Umbraco, and there's a feature in SharePoint that allows you to copy an entire page layout and replicate it over for a different language. That's not something that's out of the box in Umbraco if you talk about a single node and having multiple languages on it and being able to copy it across. It's not something that we thought an editor would ever need. But it's a workflow that they've got used to, that they've got very efficient in, and so by catching that sooner, while there's still a lot of development time left, then it's things like that that we can start to integrate in and sort of be able to provide for them. And by doing that, then we can start to see how they use things and how things might fit in. So I've got two very, very quick examples here. They're very high level, very basic. There's no code involved, there's no plugins involved. If you develop with Umbraco a lot, you may be familiar with these kind of things, but it's small, tiny tweaks that sort of really help editors to focus on what they're doing. So here we've got a potential page. It's not horrendous out of there. It allows an editor to do what they want. There are a few things in there that sort of potentially could be a problem. So highlighted a few there. We've got the two arrows. So we've got two name fields. Potentially we've got the node name, and now we've got a new name on the page. There's no discrepancy on what they are. At the moment it's the same text. What is the purpose? What's the point? The rich editor there has just been set up with every possible option, and almost certainly no editor needs every possible option. So that just gets cluttered, it gets confusing, it makes them wonder, oh, I could do anything at all here, I can try different things out, and then before you know it, every page looks different. And then highlighted that introductory paragraph there as well. Potentially we could do things with that. At the moment we're sort of reliant on them choosing the correct formatting for that paragraph, which is a bit unpredictable, and it's maybe something else that they're not going to think about. So really quickly we can just switch it over to this sort of an interface. Again, super straightforward, super basic, nothing out of the ordinary about this. A few quick things to point out. The rich that said is super simplified out. Umbraco lets us do that. We can even swap it out if we need to for a different one using packages. We've switched naming around, so now the page is called an article just above that red box at the top left. It's called an article rather than just a page. You get a bit more context about what you're creating. We now have a title, and we have some labels on there as well. They're just giving a little bit of context. We don't want to necessarily apply labels everywhere across the board, but sometimes they really help to just guide users. That's the sort of point here. We don't want to change what they do or force them to do things, we just want to guide them. And we also have the character limit there on this new introduction field. It's just been pulled out so that we have a bit more control over it. Of course, that character limit there is not actually correct, because otherwise you could put the entire article in there and still have room for more. But even still, by having a character limit, it's making an editor realize that the length matters here. Even though that number isn't going to stop them, isn't going to get in their way, they're making them think, okay, I need to be conscious about how much content I'm putting in here, I need to be aware, and not just put the whole thing in. Another super quick example that you've very likely seen before of the comparisons between the list view and the tree view. So the tree view, of course, is a fantastic way of navigating your site. It really shows the hierarchy of where your content is. It lets an editor get an idea of where they are. Where it starts to fall down a bit is when you have blogs or articles, news, repeated content, listed content, ideally. This example isn't too bad, but if you can imagine we have 200, 400 items here, it's going to get very difficult to see. It starts to slow down the loading time, and every time you create a new one, it goes to the bottom of the list, which is miles out of the way. The editor doesn't quite see it. A new editor comes along knowing that someone's published an article and they can't see anything about it until they scroll for days. So a very quick and immediate change that we can make is just selecting the list view option in Umbraco, which gives us this much cleaner view. We can search through it. We've got pagination. and we can see a bit more content around it as well. But there are further improvements that we can do to this. Again, just by clicking a few buttons, no code needed, no packages at this stage. We can switch it around to just try and make a little bit more context of it. So we've kept the name, we've kept the last edited dates. We've introduced the introduction field so we get a bit more context. And then by searching through that content, we're going to be searching all of those fields as well. So we can sort of see a bit more about where we are and what we're doing. You saw on the previous one there, we've got the sort column. The sort column doesn't really mean a lot to many people. It's just really the order of the pages that they were created in, not necessarily the most recent, not necessarily the first published or anything like that. But the list view allows us to change which column we sort on immediately. We don't have to change the nodes, we don't have to change anything permanently. But we can then, this way, we can straight away, on one page, see all of our content, we can search through it, and we can see the most recent first. Tiny, tiny things that are very straightforward to implement, that just start to get Umbraco out of the way of editors and just present things as they sort of expect them potentially a little bit more. But there are so many more things that we can do. Lots of things, we can start to provide more data automatically, so we can programmatically set values for content, potentially. Very similar to the content templates kind of idea that came across recently, where we can allow users to create things and sort of pre-populate content for them. The Umbraco Tools functionality as well, if we have the kind of editor that comes in once every 6 months to publish that one press release, and they're not really familiar with it, they don't enjoy working on the web, they don't do it very often, so then we can provide them a tool that sort of guides them through that entire process end to end, and that cuts down on support. And we can provide fallbacks and defaults as well, rather than mandatory fields. So mandatory fields often get in the way of editors. They force editors to work in a certain way that might not be how they do it. If you think maybe we know that an article needs an image on it, a news article needs an image, so if you try and publish it without an image, then it won't allow you to publish it because it's missing. But personally, when I write blogs and things like that, I'd rather write the title, publish, see the page as a whole, and then that sort of gives me a feeling for what I'm creating and where I'm creating it. In that case, we can write code that catches those things, that provides default images, and then we can even tie into event handlers on the publish or save to be able to say, okay, yep, your content's been published, but here's a warning, don't forget, we're still missing an image, you might want to add that in. If we set things as mandatory, editors might be tempted to just put anything in there to get past that blocker. Whereas if we sort of give them gentle reminders throughout the process, that might start to sort of allow them to work in the way that they're comfortable and used to. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of packages that can really help with this. These are just some of our favorites, from very simple things like the find and replace, through to Notely and UEditor notes that provide a lot more context around the content that you're writing, that can provide a bit more guidance. Things like Approve It as well, that just very simple, you can have user types that allow you to send content for approval and not publish them, but then this provides you a nice easy way of seeing all of those pages that are for approval rather than just relying on the emails that come through, and so much more as well. There's a lot of great packages that we can sort of implement here that help us. So that kind of rounds it up for editors. It's really about getting them in control of it, allowing them to use it, or allowing them to see what Umbraco can do and what ways they work sooner rather than later, so that we can still do things that guide them, and we still have time to sort of influence and sort of push them in the right direction. So if you look at developers now, this is probably our most familiar. I'd imagine a lot of us in here are or potentially were developers or involved in that development workflow and process. Development, like a lot of this, is all about the people. It's all about the communication. As this great quote says, programming is the art of telling another human what one wants the computer to do. It isn't really about giving instructions to the computer anymore. And even if it is at a very basic level, when you're designing a website, that's not really the code that we're writing. It's going through 4 or 5 stages before it gets down to a computer level. Really, the code that we write is a method of communicating with our team. And if we sort of approach it from that mindset, then we can really start to get the most out of it. And because it's a communication method, we want to make it as accessible as possible. So here we know there's lots of different statistics on it. The numbers change every time you look at it, but we're pretty confident that we spend a lot more time reading and understanding code and processing code than we do from writing it. And because of that, we want to make it easy to read, we want to make it understandable, we want to make it written in such a way that the whole team understands it as well and feels as though they can own the code in front of them and they're not sort of scared to make any changes or update it as they need to. There's this comparison here. I don't fully agree with it. It's not accurate in that sense, but it does start to highlight potential similarities there between writing code and writing content for a book. It's not a direct comparison between the two, but you could imagine if you were reading a book and every paragraph in the book was a different font, it was indented at a different level, it started to use different language, maybe even one was in Spanish and the next one's in French just because the developer prefers that. Things like that. You can imagine how difficult that book would be to read and to follow and flow and understand and be able to sort of work with. It's much the same with code. We want to have that consistency. We want to keep it nice and clean and understandable. It helps ourselves, it helps the team, it helps any future developers. This all sort of ties into clean code, the concept from Robert C. Martin, Uncle Bob. Loads of tips, loads of great content out there, so I'm not going into detail on this, but there's 3 along the top there of very quick, very simple things that we can do that really start to improve the quality of code, of just keeping naming simple and sensible. We don't need to use variable names of one character because we think it's going to be faster or the compiler is going to like us. The compiler will handle whatever we throw at it, typically. And IntelliSense will complete the rest, but it's much easier for us to read something that means something to us rather than something that tries to mean something to a computer. The comments there and making sure that things are doing one thing. And back on the comments, as it says there, comments and code are lies waiting to happen. Just because it's another thing to maintain, it's another thing to look after. That's not to say that we shouldn't use them. We should certainly use them where it makes sense to, but it's another thing to be aware of and to be conscious of. And with all of these things, practice is very important. It's always very difficult to find the time to do that outside of the typical day job. I find things like contributing to open source and contributing back to Umbraco is a great way of doing it, because not only do you feel sort of more involved in the community and the ways of working like that, but you also get to see how other people write code. You get to interact with an enormous code base that if you work at one company for a period of years, you're going to get very entrenched in that way of working. If you work on an open source project, you get to see how hundreds of developers across multiple countries write code and how that all fits into one code base that starts to make sense and solves a problem. And possibly my favorite clean code tip of them is the Boy Scout rule, which is effectively just saying leave the code base in a better state than you found it. And this comes back to potentially about those comments. So we want to sort of, every time we're interacting with the code, we want to see, is there any way of improving this? Is there anything else that we can do to this? Around the comments, if you're working on code and you see a comment nearby, we can check, is it still applicable? Does it still work? Are there to-dos that we should actually get around to? And if we're not going to, do we still need the message? This allows us to at least maintain the level of quality that we're at now, if not slowly improve it over time, which is ultimately the aim there. And as we said before around the communication, that is our goal. This heading here, Harmony Over Perfection, I got from a recent Developer Tea podcast, which is a great short 10-15 minute episode podcast. But really focuses on that idea of it's much more important that your team feel comfortable with the code and understand what they're doing than it is to have academically correct code. If you're trying to implement a design pattern that no one in your team has ever heard of, is that such a good idea? I mean, potentially, that's not to say don't do it, because there's opportunities for learning and there's opportunities for people to improve their knowledge, and we'll never learn anything if we always stick with what we know. But equally, we should sort of acknowledge who we're working with and types of people that we're working with as to writing code for the level of the team. If we introduce things that then the rest of the team are nervous to touch and only we can support, we're introducing problems into it. This all ties back to considering the future around the people. Who's going to be involved in this? Who's going to be supporting this long term? Maybe it's going to be yourself, maybe it's going to be your team, quite possibly it's going to be handed over to a client and they're going to take over the entire ownership. Because of that, we want to make sure that we're not complicating things with interesting code or interesting build pipelines just for the sake of it. You could have a very complex program that has 10 dependencies and needs a £20 a month subscription to a site just to build it and then release it, when in actual fact the client was just expecting to receive it on a USB pen. In that scenario, we're going to come up against issues again. So if we can be aware of where's this code going to end up, what teams, what kind of people are going to be supporting it, then we can not necessarily change how we work, but we can consider that and keep that in mind and make sure that we don't overcomplicate things. And on that point of build pipelines, one that we come up against quite a bit is preparing for production too soon. Quite often we see sort of the code that gets minified very early on, or people introducing a CDN for the media storage because maybe that's new and exciting and we know we need it, so let's do it now. But then you're developing on the site, you publish a new media item, you have to wait 5 minutes for a cache to clear, and it's just getting in your way. A lot of those things can usually wait until much further on in the process. If they do have to happen now, and we are using pipelines, continuous integration deployment, then we can start to introduce those through those build steps, so that the development environment is nice and simple, is nice and straightforward. The developers know that this is a code, it's just going to run, it's not going to be transpiled 5 times into something unrecognizable and undebuggable. It just keeps their environment as simple as possible, while still maintaining what we need it to do. So that brings it to a close for developers. The focus there really is on the team, the individuals, the people, because those are the people that we work with, those are the people that we interact with, and it really is that sort of method of communication that we can get the most out of. So if we go on to designers now, so designers could be from anywhere, they could be internal to our company, they could be for the client, they could be a third-party agency. So to get the most out of that sort of relationship, we want to understand where they're coming from, what their history is, what their experience is. They may not develop for the web, potentially, or if they do, they might think that everything's an app these days, which isn't strictly true. We want to understand where they're coming from. Quite often we'll have a design agency working with a client that have done their entire new brand, and they've done a nice logo and nice business cards and everything else, but then they've been asked to do the website, and that's not really what they do. So it's trying to fit these things together and understand where they're coming from. And when we do that, then we can help them, we can guide them, and we can set expectations on what to expect ultimately out of an implemented design. Depending on what the client is, what the usership is. We might have a client in the finance sector that a lot of their users are still on old IE systems, but the design is incredibly modern and it uses all sorts of fancy scrolling systems and animations and interactions that simply aren't going to be possible. They're going to be possible in some browsers for some users, but not across the board. So the sooner we can sort of spot that, the sooner we can help guide them, and they can keep with it, but we can sort of set the expectations on what their finished design is going to look like. So when it comes time to signing off, potentially we can see what the sort of state of play is. Another thing that we can do with our experience of implementing a lot of designs over time is trying to think outside the box, trying to think of what things might trip us up. A very common one that we mentioned there, being a company in Cardiff, Wales, we write a lot of bilingual and multilingual websites. Quite often the design comes to us in English, with English text on it. We might have a nice navigation with a button at the end of it. It's nice and small, it's 4 or 5 characters. We might implement that design, the designers will sign it off, and it all looks great. And then the translations come through a couple of days before go live, and all of a sudden that small button now needs 3/4 the width of the page to fit in the text. And now you don't have space for the 2 things next to each other. They've got to fall underneath. They've got to redesign things. The designers have already long gone. So now the client thinks this is your problem to fix, which can make it quite interesting to sort of, then you sort of try and design something that you didn't build and it's going to fit in, and how does it work and things like that. So by having the sort of knowledge, and over time, the more you do these things, the more of these things you pick up, we can start to anticipate these and see them coming potentially, so that we can help sort of guide things and say, okay, in that scenario, what's going to happen here? Or potentially if you just get Photoshop files and PDF files for design, how are interactions going to work? What happens when you click on a button? Is there going to be different ways of sort of interacting with that content? The sooner we sort of ask these questions, the better we can provide the output, which ties into seeing things sooner. We're not saying we should necessarily have a voice in the design. The design should be down to the client and should be implemented how they wish. But we should try and see the design as soon as possible. If there are sort of back and forth process between the designers and the client, if we can sort of almost get CC'd into those discussions and see things, this is a good opportunity for us, I find, to sort of represent the editor and try and understand how these designs are going to be implemented, how the editors are going to build the content that actually goes into and implements and provides this design. 9 times out of 10, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen it where a designer's actually designed the editor interface, despite that one being the most potentially used and interacted with from a sort of our client's user point of view. So that often falls to us to implement. So if we can see how things are going to be represented, we can see, you know, what kind of things are going to be used. Going back to the plugins that I mentioned earlier, we can then have time to research those and see what could work, what makes sense. If we see the designs just before we start the development, we'll almost have to do it the way that we know, or the quickest way to get it through. So this just gives us a bit more time, a bit more breathing space to understand what's going on and see what we can do. So with design, it's all really about being involved in that process and seeing things sooner, understanding where they're coming from, setting the expectations. So if we look through to testers and quality assurance, user acceptance testing, this is quite a short one really for their sort of process and involvement. I have 2 key points. The first one is making sure they're part of the team and introducing things. The last thing that we want is to develop something and then throw it over a wall, and then testers are just left with something that they don't fully understand, they don't really know what it is, they're just trying to make sure they can't break it, and that's not really testing it to its fullest extent. So when we're writing user stories and acceptance criteria, ideally we want the people in the room that are going to be involved in those and are going to be using those. We do want to get away from having rooms full of everyone for every time, and there's always potentially too many people in things like this. But I find it's really useful to have the client, the testers, and the developers in the room when you're coming up with acceptance criteria, because not only it gives the client the sort of comfort that we understand the requirements and they're going to get exactly this out of it. It gives the developers that sort of knowledge and expectations of what's required for them, so that when they claim something is completed, we know that it's completed to a certain standard. And then it gives the testers a better idea of how things fit together. When they see the sort of the sprints and the projects be laid out in such a way and see the acceptance criteria and things that have been written, they really get a better idea of all of the edge cases around things that they need to consider. On this one here, I'm not necessarily suggesting that they have to be Umbraco certified. That's not my point. I'm not here from Umbraco to push certification. But the point here is it's really useful for the testers to be, at the very least, aware of Umbraco, if not quite familiar with it over time. Because again, as the design is rarely designed by a designer, the Umbraco editor interface is rarely designed. The Umbraco interface is rarely tested to the fullest extent either. Of course, we don't need to test the core implementation. We know that's covered. We know that's sort of okay. But our own implementations, we should try and go a bit further than sort of getting rid of all the content. What happens to the page? Do we handle it? Try and understand and appreciate from the editor's environment, how is the workflow going to go? Maybe we can still get to that final page, but if it's very complicated and there's 20 steps, when in actual fact it was supposed to be much simpler and 4 and 5 and things are supposed to be automated, having testers that are familiar with Umbraco and can appreciate how Umbraco works and how editors are going to use it will really go a long way to making sure that not only does the website work as it was intended to, but also the editors are going to get out of it what they intended to as well. So with that, we can go on to the project managers, product owners, that sort of decision maker kind of role in a project. Again, a lot of these roles could be done by the same people or smaller people, depending on the size of the teams, the types of agencies that we're working with. Of course, for project managers, we want to keep things simple and high level, to the point. The code, the sort of infrastructure, the implementation isn't typically the major concern here. It's more about the project itself, how progress is going at a higher level. We want to keep things short and concise, but we want to keep things regular as well. If we interact daily with a project manager on a team, then all of a sudden problems don't appear as big as they could potentially be. If we sort of say that we're slowly slipping through a sprint over time, each day. That's a lot more manageable, that's a lot easier to work with than getting to the day before the end of the sprint and saying, oh no, we're not going to deliver 3/4 of this. There are things that we can do if we keep it short and concise. It helps build that relationship. And equally, if there are things that are going well, then we should be mentioning those as well. I can't think that there's ever a project manager that doesn't like to hear that the project's going well and things are on time. So that if we can sort of present that to them as well on a regular basis, it just means that that relationship stays on focus. And by raising smaller issues more often than bigger ones, it helps build that trust between the team as well. The development team understand what's going on and understand sort of the priorities and things. Clarifying the requirements is quite an interesting one. It can come across as as trying to sort of question the why behind the requirements and sort of making sure that they're coming from the right place. There is a little bit of that really, potentially depending on where requirements come from, the sort of quality of them can change. The best requirements are the ones that come from the end users, the ones that are going to be really using the system, the ones that have the problem with a current system, potentially. Then they'll go through the usual stages, go through checks of project managers, business analysts, that kind of thing. But if we can understand where they're coming from and why they're in place and who wants them, then that really helps. It helps the sense of ownership and quality from a development point of view if we understand why we're building something these days. Developers, it seems sort of more recently than not, less sort of excited by the typical means of remuneration and are more interested in the why of doing things and doing things for the right reasons, which comes all the way down to the individual tasks that they're doing. If we can understand where a requirement is coming from for a project, who wants it, why, what benefit it's going to provide, then the developers are usually a lot more engaged with delivering that and making sure that it's as high a quality as it possibly can be. And so trying to understand a bit more about the requirements, where they're coming from. Are they just a list of, we'd love it to do these 50 things, or is it really, we have these 20 problems and we're desperate for a good solution? When it comes to the development sprint itself, and our interactions, it's, in my opinion, always a good idea to overestimate the individual task a little bit, just to give us a bit more breathing space, a bit more comfort, to be able to sort of give ourselves that room to implement, to research what's the best way of really doing things and not just the way that we know, to look into, improving our testing, improving our documentation, improving our processes of doing things, and also sort of going back to the Boy Scout rule of potentially having a bit more time to look into these things. Too often we'll almost see it as a race of seeing who can do something the fastest. If you have a room developers, the one who says, I can do this in half an hour versus 2 hours, that's almost seen as a good thing and great, we can fit more into the sprint. But in actual fact, that's fine, even if it does take half an hour. Let's give it an hour, let's give it 2 hours, so that we have that bit of flexibility. We have a bit of room in the sprint that we know that we can really do things to completion and not just try and rush through functionality and build it out. This more applies to the development sprint itself rather than projects as a whole, but it just gives a bit more time in each of those sprints. And the final point here for project managers is to know and understand the deadlines from a development point of view. Of course, there's going to be the ultimate project deadline, and it's always useful to know whether that is a hard, fast deadline, or is it just because we'd like it by Christmas because we don't want to be working on this in January kind of deadline. Understanding those and being familiar with those can help sort of plan the projects and understand where we're coming from and what's needed. But equally, deadlines that come within a project, as part of a project. We have a case at the moment, for example, where one of the user stories could be implemented in 3 or 4 different ways. So at the moment we're writing prototypes for each of those to try and see which one could be the best way. The business user that has the sort of decision-making power on which one to ultimately go for is on holiday at the end of next week. So that's a sort of mid-project deadline where we need to get something done by this point so that we can get decisions, we can keep the project rolling. Understanding things like that, almost understanding where people are and when, can help structure things, can help plan things, so that we can keep things on task, we can keep things moving, and be sort of on time and understanding. So that's the final point for project managers, really. So again, it kind of comes back to, as a conclusion to sum it up, this graphic of where development sits with all of this, and how it can it is involved in all of these, and as developers it can sometimes be difficult to get developers out of their shell and to interact with these a bit more. It isn't an easy problem to solve, and quite often developers will prefer to just put their head up and have a coffee and write the code. But if we can start to appreciate these different audiences that we have and our interaction with them, and the experience that we have from working with multiple designs, from multiple clients, from multiple testers and project managers, then we can really start to use that experience to influence them, and not change the way they work, but guide how they deliver. And if we can do that, then we can start to really tailor things and provide the best outcome. But of course, as I said earlier, in my opinion, the editors are the number one audience out of those, because ultimately they rely on what we deliver to do their jobs. A website can be solved in many different ways, but if a client has to publish things by certain points, by certain dates, we want them to be able to do that. We want the CMS to get out of the way. We want to make sure that it's tailored to exactly what they're after and can be used in the way that they want to. But that doesn't mean we should forget about the others. We should consider all of them. Question mark there, there's almost certainly others that we can include into this, depending on your projects, depending on your clients, things like that. But there are so many people that we interact with throughout the life cycle of a project. And being able to appreciate those different audiences can make sure that we're all working together towards the best possible outcome for the clients, for the project, and for the teams. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming along this morning and listening. Email address is at the bottom. The bold part is the Twitter. If you have any questions or anything like that, I can open it up to any questions now. Otherwise, I'm around all day and this evening. But otherwise, thank you very much.